Now, it should come as no surprise based on the name that Sublime Text is a text editor. And when it comes to editing text, few things can disrupt your workflow and slow down your throughput faster than having to take your hands away from the keyboard to reach for a mouse to carry out an action. That's why keyboard shortcuts are so important. There's only so many keys on the keyboard that you could bind, but Sublime has a feature to help you with that, and that's why this week's video is about applying context to your Sublime Text key bindings. Hello, fellow Sublime Text fanatics. ODAT Nerd here. Welcome to this video on applying context to your key bindings in Sublime Text. And before we jump into that, I'd like to say that I hope everybody is finding these videos helpful, useful, informative, and that it's helping you in your day-to-day usage of Sublime Text. And if any of that is true, please do use those buttons down below the video to thumb, subscribe, and share to let me know about it. And remember that if you ever have any questions or comments on the content of the video, requests for clarification if something's not quite clear, or you have suggestions for other topics you'd like me to cover in a future video, all that's good stuff goes down in the comment section below this video. And you can also, of course, always hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd as well. But as we say, we're here to talk about applying context to your key bindings in Sublime Text, which is a very powerful topic. Now, there is documentation, official documentation on this, which I have linked down in the description of the video. Now, though we're going to go through a few examples here, that's going to be a key reference for you until you get used to all of the different contexts that are available for you to use and how they all fit together. So do remember to take a look at that. Additionally, throughout the video, when we're working on key bindings, we're going to see that I'm using the package dev package, which we have covered in other videos on the channel, and that applies, amongst other things, to Sublime, the ability to have a better syntax highlighting for key bindings, auto completions, and snippets that makes key bindings easier to create. So if you're not already using that package, perhaps this video will convince you that it's something that you should be using. And if you're not already using the package, don't worry. Even though things are going to look a little different when you do it, the same information still always applies. And one last thing, there is a plugin up above my head here in the window. It's a very simple plugin. It just displays a message box when you invoke the command and displays whatever message that you give it. We're going to be using that throughout the examples and a little bit later in the video so that we can see when our key bindings are being activated without doing destructive modifications to the buffer. There is a command that's built into Sublime named echo. You can give the echo command absolutely any arguments you want, and all it does is display its arguments down in the console of the window, which, remember, you can get to by going to the view menu and choosing the show console item or pressing the associated key binding of control backtick. And we're going the route of the plugin in this video so that we don't have to keep bouncing down into the console every time we push a key to see if something's happened. With all that out of the way, let's dive into what a context actually is. So the first question you might have is, what actually is a context? And simply stated, a context is just a precondition that you can apply to your key binding that Sublime will evaluate in order to determine if your key binding should be active or not. If a key binding has context, which can have one or more, then those conditions are evaluated by Sublime, and only when all of them are satisfied is the key binding considered to be active. If even one of them is not satisfied, then that key binding will be not active in that situation. And in that case, Sublime would go on to try to find another key binding which perhaps has context that is satisfied, or which doesn't have context, it's just a regular key binding, and it would use that one instead. This is an incredibly powerful concept because it allows you to take the same sequence of keys and bind it to multiple commands or to the same command with multiple arguments based on the situation that you're using that command in. And this is actually used a lot in the default key bindings for the platform for things like automatic quote pairing. You'll know when you push a double quote key in various situations, two quotes will appear for you to type things inside. And if you have two quotes and the cursor is right between them and you backspace, both of the quotes go away. Now, logically, we know that that doesn't always happen. Backspace doesn't always delete the characters on both sides of it, and double quotes don't always auto pair in. That's an example of context in action. Sublime is using these to determine when it should or should not take those particular actions. And as we saw in the previous video, a key bindings file is just a list of key bindings objects, which are JSON objects with keys that tell Sublime what key presses you're interested in, what command to run when that key binding is activated, and what arguments the command takes. And if you're not familiar with that particular aspect, go back and watch that video, and this will make a lot more sense. It should come as no surprise then that when you supply a context to your key bindings, you're supplying it as a JSON object. In just a minute, we're going to show some examples of context in action, but first we need to know what these context objects actually contain, because they are just JSON objects after all. And there are a few keys that these can contain, much like key bindings have a specific set of keys that are valid in them. And the most important of these is the key unhelpfully labeled key. That specifies the condition that you'd like Sublime to check. Now we have a few of them here in the file, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's a list of the context that ship with Sublime in the official documentation, which is linked in the description. It's also possible for plugins to provide context as well by way of an event listener that has an on-query context member. So that means that packages that you have installed would possibly have their own context as well, and even you as a user of Sublime, if you know enough Python, could create your own context as well if none of the ones that it ships with apply to your specific situation. And if you were ever to look in the key bindings for a particular package, you might find some of these contexts that that package has supplied on its own, because it's one of the more common things package authors that have key bindings can do to make sure that their key bindings only apply in their particular package's situation and not globally all over everywhere. So the first of the conditions here that we have is selector, and that allows you to match the scope at the current cursor location with one that you provide. And if you don't know how scopes work, there is a video on the channel that covers that particular topic, because it is a pretty big topic, but an incredibly powerful one. This is the one that's perhaps more common in just user key bindings, because it allows you to make your key bindings active in only specific types of files, or also in specific locations in types of files. For example, you could say this key binding only applies in a Python file, or this key binding only applies in an HTML file, or this key binding only applies inside of a comment in an HTML file, things of that nature. The next three items here, text, following text, and preceding text, allow you to evaluate the content of the current selection, or the text to the left of the cursor, or the text to the right of the cursor on whatever line the cursor is on, in order to determine if your key binding should be active based on what's surrounding it. And these are the ones that are used in those auto pairing key bindings that I mentioned to be able to determine if it should auto pair, or if the backspace key is in a position where it should delete the left and the right quote from around itself and put you back to the state that you were in before you inserted them in the first place. The next couple allow you to apply context to selections, specifically being able to determine if there's a specific number of selections in the file. For example, one or more than one, which might be handy if you have a command that's going to insert text. You want to make sure that it only ever applies when there's exactly one cursor in the file, so you don't accidentally inject things multiple places. This is a way to do that. Similarly, if you have a command that's bound that is going to do something with selected text, you might want to make sure that there's actually text selected before the command is executed, in which case you could use selection empty to test for that condition as well. And this last one here allows your key binding to check the value of any preference in your default user preferences whose value is a Boolean value, which is true or false, in order to determine if it should be active. And again, this is really common in the default key bindings. The ones for auto pairing quotes, for example, are only active, those key bindings, when the auto pairing setting is enabled inside of your preferences. The key named key is telling Sublime what condition we'd like it to check. The next two in our list here, operator and operand, are used by Sublime to determine how it should actually carry out that particular condition check. And the values that we see here for operator are the list of operators that are available. Unlike the key, if you create a plugin, you're not allowed to create your own operators. Unsurprisingly, equal or not equal allows you to check if something is equal to or not equal to something else, like the number of selections is equal to 1, or the selection is definitely not empty, things of that nature. When it comes to the keys that specify text and things of that nature, such as text following text and preceding text, you can use the operators regex match, not regex match, regex contains, and not regex contains in order to give a regular expression that has to match or contain or not be contained in, as is appropriate based on the operator, the text that is specified there. And this is what you would use to say the regular expression provided must match the text prior to the cursor in order for my key binding to be active, or the selection has to contain this regular expression match in order for my command to execute. The operand specifies the value that Sublime should be checking, and this can be one of three things. It can be a string, it can be a Boolean value, which is true or false, and it can be a number. And which one of those you use depends on the key that you're using. So you might need to look at the documentation to determine which one to use. For example, the setting context that is listed above, that always checks a Boolean setting, so the operand should be a Boolean. The number of selections is a number, so in that case, you would apply a number there. And if you were doing something with that required a regular expression, like using text following text or a scope selector with the selector key, then you would need that to be a string. Now, the last item in here is match all, and this is not always needed in a context. You'll see it's very often not provided. It's only applied by specific contexts, and that is contexts that deal with selections in the buffer. And just as a clarification, when we're talking about selections here, we're talking about carets that appear in the buffer or cursors that appear in the buffer. If you just see a cursor, that is a selection in Sublime, but it's an empty selection because it's not spanning any characters. It's not selecting anything. It's just sitting between two characters. If that has some selected text associated with the cursor, that's still a selection, but now it's a non-empty selection. And in specifically the case of keys that are dealing with selections, like the text before or after the cursor or the text contained inside of the selection, you can use match all to tell Sublime that this context should be applied to every one of those selections, and it has to apply to all of them equally. So if you wanted to make sure that this key binding only triggers when the word Bob appears prior to every cursor, you would need to specify match all true. The last thing to point out here is that although you always have to provide a key because you need to tell Sublime what it is you're trying to test against, all of the other values here have default values, so you don't need to specify them unless you want to change the default. As we can see, the default operator is equal and the default operand is true. So if you're using the setting context, for example, that's testing against a Boolean and you want to test that something is turned on, you don't need to specify an operator and you don't need to specify an operand. Similarly, if you're doing something with selections and you don't care if it matches all of them, if it only has to match one, then you don't need to specify match all because the default for this value is in fact false. Whereas if you wanted to verify that it does apply at every position, only in that case would you have to specify true. With all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and jump into some concrete examples so we can see this stuff in actual practice. So to start with, you have to open your key bindings, and remember there are a variety of ways to do that up here in the Preferences menu, which is under Sublime Text in the main menu if you're on Mac OS. There's a key bindings item that will open the bindings window with the defaults on the left and yours on the right. If you're instead wanting to work on key bindings based on something that a package provides, you come down to Package Settings, find the package you're interested in, and it will have a key bindings item as well if it has key bindings. And also remember that some packages that are before Sublime had the ability to open these in a split window with the default on the left and yours on the right. There'll be two options there. You can use this one to see what the defaults for a package are and the user to open your own file. You can, of course, also use View Package File to open your key bindings, which we have showed in a previous video. And that's what I did here just so that we have more screen real estate. Let's start by creating a regular non-context key binding so we can verify that the plugin we're using to test actually works. So we'll bind that to Control-Alt-T because that's a nice easy key binding for me to hit. We want to execute the message box command, and that takes an argument of message that is the message to display, such as I am the default binding, like so. We'll even spell it correctly. And just like that, our key binding is active. And this demonstrates the power of package dev because auto completion makes that really easy to do. Now, when I push the key, we get the dialog box, I am the default binding. So our plugin definitely works. And remember, if you don't want to use this plugin, you could just use the echo command as well, and you'll see it displaying items in the Sublime console when the key binding becomes active. Now that we know that works, let's go ahead and create a key binding with a context. And for the remainder of these, I'm just going to paste this stub in because these are all going to be the same thing anyway. And in this case, let's say we want to provide a context that specifies that this key binding is only active in certain specific types of files. So we might say, for example, because this is a key map file and it's JSON, that I am in a JSON file like so. And we can see here that our key binding has a key named context, and it's a list. It's going to be a list of those context objects that we would like Sublime to verify before this key binding becomes active. So the very first one we're going to use here is this one. We're going to use the selector key because that's the one that is used to verify whether or not a particular file type is active. And what we're going to test is that this scope selector equals a specific value, and the scope that we're going to use is source.json. And once again, if you're not familiar with scopes and how scopes and scope matching works, do view that video on that because it's, as I said, a complicated topic, but an incredibly powerful one. And this scope selector can be really anything to your heart's content. And you can also look in the default key bindings for some more examples of that. So I'm going to save that binding, and we might expect now that since I'm in a JSON file, that when I push the key, that this is the key that's going to be activated. And when I push the key, it still says I'm the default binding. Now, if you remember from the previous video, I said that logically speaking, and again, we don't know exactly how this is implemented inside of Sublime, but logically speaking, what Sublime has is a big long list of key bindings, starting with the default bindings, going through all of the packages you have installed with yours on the bottom. And when you press a key, it starts at the bottom of the key binding list and steps upwards through until it finds something that matches the key that you've pressed. And the reason we say that is how this works is because the order of the bindings in the file is in fact important. Because Sublime is starting from the last key binding act that was added to the file and moving upwards, before it even gets to this one to determine that it should be used in a specific situation, it's already found this key binding here, the one that is the default binding that has no context. It has no context, it's always active, it just always uses that one. So the important takeaway here is that you need to order the items in your key map file if you're going to use the same key from the most specific at the bottom to the least specific at the top so that there isn't any ambiguity. So by just moving this binding up in the file like so and saving, now when I push the key, it says I'm in a JSON file. But if I was to create just a standard tab and use it here, it's the default binding. So we have two key bindings bound to the exact same key, but only one of them applies in a certain situation. If we're in a JSON file, that bottom one is the one that's active. Sublime stops its search, executes that command. Otherwise, it proceeds upwards and finds the default binding and uses that one instead. And of course, if you didn't have a binding like this in your user file, if it was something from the default bindings or some other package, it would just continue up and find that one instead. For the next example, let's go ahead and use the items that allow you to verify how many selections there are in the buffer. So as you'll recall, there are a couple of different contexts for that. We might want to test that there's exactly one selection. So there is a single selection, like so. And the context that we would apply in that case, if remember that list we were looking at, is num selections. And we want to test that there's a single selection, so we would use equal as the operator. And as the operand, we want the number 1 because we want to test if there's a single selection. And for our second binding, we would go ahead and say that there are, for example, there are many selections instead. And in our context, when we inject it in here, we'd again use num selections, but this time we would use not equal instead. And again, the number to that is 1. So we're going to save that. In this case, I removed the default binding because there's always going to be at least one selection or more than one selection. So now that I just have the cursor here, when I push the key, there is a single selection. Similarly, if this selection actually wraps some amount of text, it's still a single selection. But if we were to use the key bindings to add multiple cursors to our file, now there are many selections. So again, imagine a situation where you want to absolutely verify that there is only one cursor, or that there are definitely more than one cursor, or there's exactly 5 cursors. Whatever situation you can conceive of, you can test it with this key binding. Now for our next example, let's try something just slightly different here. We'll go ahead and get rid of all of these bindings, and we can actually test if the selection has any text inside of it, which again, you might want if you're doing something that absolutely has to have text selected because you're going to wrap the selection in something. This is a great way to do that very thing. So again, we would just input our little stub in here, and we could say the selection is empty, like so, if that is the sort of thing that you wanted to check. And when it comes to creating the context here, the context key that you would use is the, no, excuse me, not that one. It is the selection empty one. Pardon me, I picked the wrong auto completion there. Note that when you comes to this next part where we say operator, we want to be able to test if this is equal or not equal. We can go ahead and pop that up here if we're not sure what the values are that we want. So we want to say selection empty equals, and we want to say true because we want to know that the selection is definitely empty in this case. And these auto completions in package dev really make this a lot easier if you forget how these things work. And we can come up here to the next one here and say the selection is not empty, which might be the other way you want to do this. And again, in that case, you would say selection empty as the key and not equal and true. You could also say equals false if you prefer to do it that way. So now there's just a single cursor in the file. That means there is a single selection, but the selection is empty. It's not selecting any text. So the box says that the selection is empty. But if we were to select a word like so, now the selection is not empty. Now for our last example, again, we'll get rid of this binding. And let's say that we might actually want to do something based on the text that's on the line. And remember, you can do something based on the text to the left of the cursor, or to the text that's to the right of the cursor, or the text that's currently selected as well, and any combination of those items as well. Because although we're not seeing it here in the bindings that we're using in our simple examples, your context can contain as many of these context objects as you want. We want to do something with text here, so we'll inject our stub and we will say the previous text ends in context, like so, and then we need to provide a context. And because we want the text that's previous to the cursor, that is the preceding text item, and we're going to test that that is a regular expression match, and the regular expression to match against is any number of characters followed by the word context, and then the end of the input. And in both of these in the case of the preceding text and following text items, what Sublime's actually going to do is take the entire text either from the start of the line up to the left of the cursor, or from the right of the cursor to the end of the line, and match the regular expression against that. So although this has a $sign, that just is meaning that the regular expression has to be matched and anchored with the text immediately to the left of the cursor. So now if the cursor is say on this line right here, when I push the key binding, nothing happens. There's no binding there. But if the cursor was at this location when I push the key, now it does say that the previous text ends in context, so we have that. Now what happens if there was a second cursor in the file? For example, if I had a cursor here as well. When I push the key, what's going to happen? It's going to say the previous text ends in context, which is true for one of the cursors, but not for both of them. And that's where that last context item comes in, the one that we mentioned previously, match all, which I'm going to put down here. It defaults, match all, defaults to the value of false, meaning this context doesn't have to apply to every cursor, only to at least one of them. But we want it to apply to all of them, say, for example, so we would set that to true. And now, again, we can see if it's right here, the binding works. If we're even one line up, it doesn't do anything. And if the cursor is there and there's a one extra cursor here on top of this, it also doesn't work because it doesn't match both of those particular items. The same sorts of tests can be used to apply to the text that, of course, that's in the selection or to the right. And you can even combine these by making sure that there's certain text to the left of the cursor and certain text to the right as well. So as we can see, although it seems like it's going to be a complicated topic, context in Sublime Text key bindings is really not that hard at all. Now that we have a more understanding of how those all work, you can jump on into the default key bindings in Sublime and see how some of the magic is happening under the hood. You probably also have a million different ideas for things you can do in your own key bindings to customize Sublime in just the right way to kick your productivity up a couple of notches as well. So I hope you found this video informative and helpful. And if you have, please use those buttons down below the video to thumb, subscribe, and share as you deem appropriate. And as always, if you have any questions or comments or requests for clarification or suggestions for other topics you'd like me to cover in a future video, go ahead and drop those on down into the comment section below the video. I'd love to hear from you. And you can, of course, always hit me on Twitter at ODATNerd as well. That's going to do it for this video. Until the next one, this is ODATNerd asking you to please have a sublime day.